Copper Ridge, Montana Territory, 1878. The whispers started the moment Grace Garrett stepped off the morning stage, carrying nothing but a worn carpetbag and the weight of her ruined reputation. At 22 years old, she had learned that scandal traveled faster than any locomotive, and the stares of the townsfolk confirmed that her shame had arrived before she did. She kept her chin high despite the trembling in her hands, her dark blonde hair pulled back in a simple bun that did nothing to hide the delicate beauty of her features. The blue calico dress she wore was modest and proper, but no amount of respectability in her clothing could erase what everyone already knew about her. She had been the talk of Denver society until 3 months ago, when her engagement to a prominent banker's son had ended in public disgrace. The details hardly mattered now, though they had been dissected in every parlor and whispered behind every gloved hand. What mattered was that Jonathan Prescott had ruined her and cast her aside, leaving her with nowhere to go except to her widowed aunt in this dusty frontier town where she prayed no one would know her story. That prayer died within the first hour. Grace believed with absolute certainty that she was irredeemably stained, that no decent person would ever look at her with anything but judgment, and that her only path forward was to live quietly in the shadows, accepting whatever scraps of existence she could salvage. Love was for women who still had their virtue intact. The frontier was harsh enough without adding impossible dreams to the burden. She found her aunt's boarding house on the edge of town, a weathered 2-story building that leaned slightly to the left. Martha Garrett greeted her niece with a firm embrace and knowing eyes that held more compassion than condemnation. "I will not ask what happened in Denver," her aunt said quietly, leading Grace inside. "But I will tell you that this town has a long memory and loose tongues. Keep your head down, help me with the boarders, and perhaps in time, they will find someone else to talk about." Grace nodded, grateful for the refuge even if it came with warnings. She spent her first week learning the rhythms of the boarding house, serving meals to ranch hands and miners who watched her with varying degrees of curiosity and speculation. She heard the whispers, saw the way respectable women crossed the street to avoid her, felt the weight of being Copper Ridge's newest source of gossip. What she did not expect was Mason Cole. He arrived on a Thursday evening with 3 other cowboys from the Double C Ranch, their spurs jingling as they stomped the dust from their boots on the front porch. Grace was clearing dishes from the dining table when they entered, and she kept her eyes down as her aunt greeted them warmly. These were regular boarders, men who stayed in town between cattle drives and spent their wages on hot meals and clean beds. "Grace, come meet the boys," Martha called, and Grace had no choice but to step forward with a polite smile that did not reach her eyes. She saw the cowboys first as a group, weather-beaten men with easy grins and trail dust still clinging to their clothes. Then her gaze landed on the youngest of them, and something in her chest tightened unexpectedly. Mason Cole could not have been more than 25, tall and lean with the athletic build of a man who spent his days in the saddle. His hat was pushed back to reveal dark brown hair and a face that was almost startlingly handsome in its clean-lined masculinity. He had the beginning of stubble along his jaw, and when he met her eyes, his own were a clear gray that seemed to see past her carefully constructed walls. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat with a courtesy that made her throat tighten. The other men nodded their greetings, but Mason's gaze lingered a moment longer before her aunt ushered them to the table. Grace retreated to the kitchen, her hands shaking as she prepared coffee. She told herself it meant nothing, that polite greeting from a cowboy who would surely hear the stories about her before the week was out. Men like him, decent men with honest work and clear eyes, were not meant for women like her. But when she returned with the coffee pot, Mason looked up and smiled at her, a genuine smile that held no judgment or speculation, just simple human warmth. "That smells like heaven after a week on the range, miss." "It is just coffee," she said quietly, filling his cup. "Best thing I have smelled in days," he insisted, and the man next to him laughed. "That is because you have been smelling cattle and Charlie's cooking coal. Anything would seem like heaven after that." The table erupted in good-natured ribbing, and Grace found herself almost smiling as she finished her rounds. When she retreated to the kitchen again, she caught herself watching through the doorway as Mason talked with his friends, noting the easy way he laughed, the respectful tone he used with her aunt, the quick intelligence in his eyes. She forced herself to look away, Whatever foolish flutter she felt in her chest was nothing more than loneliness making her vulnerable. Mason Cole would learn what everyone else knew soon enough, and that warm smile would turn cold. The next morning, Grace was hanging laundry in the yard when she heard boots on the path behind her. She turned to find Mason approaching, his hat in his hands and an almost shy expression on his face. "Morning, Miss Garrett," he said. "I hope I am not intruding. I wanted to thank you properly for last night's meal. Your aunt mentioned you do most of the cooking." Grace's fingers tightened on the wet sheet she was holding. "It is nothing special, just simple fare." "Maybe so, but it beats trail beans and hardtack by a country mile." He shifted his weight, looking unexpectedly nervous for a man who likely faced down ornery cattle and wild horses without blinking. "I was wondering if you might have time to walk with me this Sunday after church. There is a place up by the creek that is real pretty this time of year." The hope that had begun to bloom in Grace's chest withered instantly. She set down the sheet carefully, not looking at him. "You should know something about me before you ask questions like that, Mr. Cole." "It is Mason, please." Mason, then. She forced herself to meet his eyes, steeling herself for what would come next. "I am not the kind of woman a decent man takes walking. You should ask Martha or any of the women in town. They will tell you all about Grace Garrett and why you should keep your distance." Something flickered in his gray eyes, but it was not the disgust or dismissal she expected. Instead, he stepped closer, his voice dropping low. "Miss Grace, I have been working ranches since I was 14 years old. I have seen enough of life to know that stories rarely tell the whole truth and gossip tells even less. I do not care what people say about you. I care about the woman who served coffee with kind hands even when she was hurting, who kept her eyes down because she is scared of being hurt again, who has sad eyes that make me want to know what put that sadness there." Grace's breath caught. No one had spoken to her like this since the scandal, as if she was still a person worthy of care rather than an object of pity or scorn. "You do not know anything about me." "No, ma'am, I do not." "That is why I want to take you walking, to learn." He waited, patient and steady, his hat still in his hands. She should refuse. She should protect him from the taint of her reputation and protect herself from the inevitable pain when he learned the details and changed his mind about her. But there was something in his eyes that made her want to believe, just for a moment, that perhaps the frontier could offer her something more than mere survival. "The stones by the creek," she heard herself ask. His face lit up with a smile that transformed him from handsome to breathtaking. "Yes, ma'am, I will call for you Sunday at 2, if that suits." "It suits," she whispered, and watched him walk away with a lightness in his step that matched the sudden, terrifying lightness in her heart. The rest of the week passed in a haze of anticipation and dread. Grace caught herself looking for Mason at meals, noticed the way he always met her eyes and smiled, observed how he treated her aunt with genuine respect and the other boarders with easy camaraderie. He was everything a woman could want in a man, hardworking, kind, handsome in a way that made her pulse quicken whenever he walked into a room, which made it all the more painful when she overheard the conversation on Saturday afternoon. She had been upstairs changing linens when voices drifted up from the front porch. Two of the town matrons stood there, supposedly calling on her aunt but clearly more interested in gossip than genuine visiting. "I tell you, Martha, it is a disgrace having that girl under your roof," Mrs. Henderson said in a voice that carried. "Everyone knows what happened in Denver. The banker's son ruined her, plain and simple, and when she tried to trap him into marriage anyway, his family exposed her scheming to the whole city. The girl has no shame." Grace's hands stilled on the sheet she was folding. "She came here with nothing, probably cast out by her own family," Mrs. Whitmore added, "and now she is serving meals to unmarried men, putting herself in their path. Mark my words, she will try to sink her claws into one of them next. Ladies, that is quite enough." Her aunt's voice was steel. "Grace is my niece and a good girl who deserves compassion, not cruelty. Whatever happened in Denver, she has come here for a fresh start, and I will thank you to keep your speculation to yourselves. We are only trying to warn you, Martha. And warn those poor cowboys too, before one of them gets tangled up with damaged goods." Grace had heard enough. She dropped the sheet and fled to her small room, pressing her hands over her mouth to hold back the sob that wanted to escape. This was what she had known all along, what she had tried to tell herself when Mason asked to walk with her. She was damaged goods, stained, unworthy. The worst part was that the story was not entirely wrong. Jonathan Prescott had courted her for 6 months, had promised her marriage, had convinced her that their love was pure and true enough to permit certain liberties before the wedding. She had been foolish enough to believe him, to trust him with her innocence. And when she had insisted on setting a wedding date, his family had turned on her viciously, claiming she was a schemer trying to trap their son into marriage above her station. The truth was complicated and painful and ultimately did not matter because the result was the same. Her reputation was destroyed, her family had sent her away in shame, and she would carry the stain of her poor judgment for the rest of her life. She should cancel the walk with Mason. She should save him from association with her and save herself from the pain of watching his affection turn to disgust when he learned the full story. But when Sunday came and he appeared at the door with wildflowers in his hand and that hopeful smile on his face, she found she could not say no. They walked in silence for the first few minutes, leaving the edge of town behind as they followed a narrow path toward the creek. Mason did not try to fill the quiet with empty chatter, seemingly content just to be near her. Grace found herself relaxing slightly despite her anxiety, drawn into the peace of the landscape and the steady, undemanding presence of the man beside her. The creek appeared around a bend, rushing with late spring runoff and flanked by cottonwoods just beginning to leaf out. Smooth stones lined the bank, worn round by countless seasons of water and weather. Mason led her to a flat boulder that overlooked the water and helped her settle her skirts before sitting beside her. "I come here when I need to think," he said, watching the water flow past. "Something about the sound of it clears my head." Grace traced a pattern on the stone between them. "It is beautiful." "Yes," he said, but when she glanced over, he was looking at her instead of the landscape. Heat rose in her cheeks and she looked away quickly. "Mason, you need to understand something. Those women who were talking to my aunt yesterday, they are right about me. I am not some innocent victim. I made choices in Denver, foolish choices, and I am paying the consequences. You should not be here with me. It will only damage your reputation too." "Let me tell you something about my reputation," Mason said quietly. "I am the youngest of 5 brothers and the only one who did not take to farming like my father wanted. When I was 16, I left home against his wishes to work ranches. My mother cried, my father said I was throwing my life away, and my brothers told me I would come crawling back within a month." He picked up a smooth stone and turned it over in his palm. "I have been working cattle for 9 years now. I have been thrown by horses, kicked by steers, nearly trampled in a stampede outside Cheyenne. I have slept on the ground more nights than I have slept in a bed. I have $5 to my name after a year of work because I am trying to save enough to buy my own land someday. By my family's standards, by society's standards, I am nothing much, just another cowboy drifting from ranch to ranch." He looked at her then, his gray eyes intense. "But I know who I am. I am a man who keeps his word, who works hard, who treats people decent regardless of what others say about them. And I am a man who knows that Grace Garrett has more genuine kindness in her little finger than most of the so-called respectable people in this town have in their whole bodies." Grace's throat tightened with emotion. "You do not know what I did." "Then tell me, not what others say happened, but what actually happened. Tell me your story, Grace, and let me decide for myself what I think of it." She looked at the water, at the stones, at anything but him as the words began to spill out. She told him about Jonathan Prescott, about the courtship and the promises and the naive trust that had led her to give him what should have been saved for her wedding night. She told him about the humiliation when his family turned on her, about the public accusations and the private shame, about her own family's disappointment and their decision to send her away. "The worst part is that they are right," she finished, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was foolish. I believed pretty words and trusted a man who did not deserve it. I gave away something precious and got nothing but shame in return. I am damaged goods, Mason, stained, not fit for any decent man." The silence that followed felt endless. Grace waited for him to stand up, to make some excuse and leave her sitting alone on this rock with her confession hanging in the air between them. Instead, she felt his hand, rough and warm, settle gently over hers. "Grace, look at me." She forced herself to meet his eyes, expecting pity or disappointment. What she saw instead was fierce tenderness. You loved someone who did not deserve your love. You trusted someone who betrayed that trust. That does not make you damaged, it makes you human. His thumb stroked across her knuckles, sending shivers up her arm. And if that man could not see the treasure he was throwing away, then he is the biggest fool who ever walked the earth. How can you say that? You barely know me. I know enough. I know you work from dawn until after dark helping your aunt without complaint. I know you serve meals with a gentle hand even when people treat you poorly. I know you have sad eyes that make my chest ache, and when you almost smiled the other night, it was like watching the sun come out from behind clouds. He shifted closer, his voice dropping low. I know that sitting here with you feels more right than anything has felt in a long time, and I know I want the chance to learn more if you will let me. Grace felt tears sliding down her cheeks, but for the first time in months, they were not entirely tears of shame. Why would you want someone like me when you could court any respectable girl in town? Because I do not want any respectable girl in town. I want you, Grace Garrett, with all your scars and sadness and strength. I want the woman who survived scandal and kept going, who has enough courage to start over in a place where everyone knows her story. That is the woman I see when I look at you. Something cracked open in Grace's chest, some tight knot of shame and self-protection that had been choking her for months. She let herself cry while Mason held her hand, his presence solid and steady beside her, not trying to fix her pain but simply bearing witness to it. When the tears finally slowed, she wiped her eyes with her free hand and managed a shaky laugh. I am sorry, this is not much of a walk by the creek. This is exactly what it needed to be, Mason said firmly. He stood and offered her his hand. Come on, let me show you the best part. He led her upstream to where the creek widened into a clear pool, the water so transparent she could see smooth pebbles covering the bottom. Dragonflies darted across the surface, and a kingfisher watched them from a branch overhead. This is where I come when the world feels too heavy, Mason said. Something about this place makes me believe good things are still possible, that a cowboy with nothing but dreams and determination might actually make something of himself someday. That the frontier does not have to be just about surviving, but maybe about building something that lasts. Grace heard the longing in his voice, the same longing she had tried to bury under layers of shame and resignation. Do you really believe that fresh starts are possible? I have to believe it, or what is the point of any of this? He gestured at the landscape around them, the vast Montana territory stretching in all directions. My whole life is a fresh start, Grace. Every day I wake up and choose to keep working towards something better. Why should your life be any different? Because you did not do anything wrong. You just chose a different path than your family wanted. I made a mistake that cost me everything. No, Mason said firmly. A man who lies and manipulates to get what he wants, then abandons the woman he claimed to love, that is a mistake that costs. You trusted someone you should not have trusted. That is just learning, painful learning, but still learning. He turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. Grace, I cannot promise that people will stop talking or that this will be easy. But I can promise that I see you, really see you, and I like what I see. I want to keep seeing you if you are willing. Not because I pity you or because I am trying to rescue you, but because when I am with you, I feel less alone. This frontier is harsh and lonely, and I have told myself for years that love is a luxury cowboys like me cannot afford. But maybe I was wrong. Maybe love is exactly what makes the frontier bearable. Grace looked at their joined hands, at this young cowboy who was offering her something she had thought forever beyond her reach. A chance to be seen as something other than a scandal, to be valued despite her past, to believe that maybe her story was not finished after all. I am afraid, she admitted, afraid to hope and have it taken away again, afraid that you will change your mind when the reality of being associated with me becomes clear. Afraid that I do not know how to do this, how to let someone close after everything that happened. Then we will be afraid together, Mason said simply, and we will figure it out as we go. That is all anyone does, Grace. They just keep going and hope it works out. She took a shaky breath and nodded. I would like to keep seeing you, Mason Cole, even though I think you might be the biggest fool in Montana territory for wanting to court damaged goods. His smile was brilliant. Then I will be a fool gladly, as long as it means spending time with you. They walked back to town slowly, talking more easily now that the worst secrets were in the open. Mason told her about his dreams of owning his own ranch someday, about the land he had his eye on near the mountains. Grace found herself talking about the life she had imagined before everything fell apart, the small hopes she had carried and then buried. When they reached her aunt's boarding house, Mason squeezed her hand gently before releasing it. "May I call on you again? Maybe take you to the social next Saturday if you are willing to face the gossips with me." Grace's first instinct was to refuse, to spare him the censure that would come from being seen publicly with her. But something in his hopeful expression made her reconsider. If Mason could face the world with his head high despite being just a drifting cowboy, perhaps she could find the same courage. "I would like that," she said softly. His smile made her heart flutter. "Then it is a date, Miss Garrett." The week that followed was a study in contrasts. Grace found herself floating through her chores, catching herself smiling at odd moments as she remembered something Mason had said or the way his eyes had looked at her by the creek. At the same time, she was acutely aware of the increased scrutiny from the town, the way people watched her even more closely now that word had spread about the cowboy courting the scandalous girl from Denver. Martha noticed the change in her niece and pulled her aside one evening after the dinner dishes were cleared. "I see Mason Cole has been calling on you." Grace braced herself for a lecture but found only curiosity in her aunt's expression. "Yes, ma'am, I hope that is acceptable. Mason is a good man, a bit young and rough around the edges but good through and through." Martha studied her niece carefully. "The question is whether you are ready for what courting him will mean." "People will talk, Grace, they already are. Some will say you are trying to trap another man, others will pity him for being taken in by you. It will not be easy." "I know," Grace twisted her hands together. "Part of me thinks I should end it before it goes any further to save him from that, but another part of me wants to be selfish just this once, to have something good even if I do not deserve it." "Who says you do not deserve it?" Martha's voice was sharp. "A group of gossips who do not know the whole story, a boy who used you and threw you away. Grace, you made a mistake, but you are not defined by that mistake unless you choose to be. Mason Cole is offering you a chance to choose differently." Grace felt tears prick her eyes. "What if I ruin things again? What if I am not capable of being what he needs?" "What if you are?" Martha countered. "What if you stop assuming the worst and let yourself hope for the best? This is the frontier, child. People come here to reinvent themselves every day. Why should you be any different?" The words echoed what Mason had said by the creek, and Grace felt something shift inside her, some small loosening of the shame that had been her constant companion for months. Maybe, just maybe, she could choose to believe in second chances. The night of the social arrived with Grace's nerves stretched tight. She had only one good dress, a soft green cotton that had survived the journey from Denver, and she spent extra time arranging her dark blonde hair in a style that made her feel less like damaged goods and more like a woman going to a dance. When Mason arrived to collect her, the expression on his face made all the fussing worthwhile. He looked stunned, standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands and his mouth slightly open. "Grace, you look beautiful," he finally managed. She felt herself blushing. "You clean up well yourself, Mr. Cole." He did. Gone were the dusty work clothes, replaced by pressed trousers, a clean shirt, and a vest that emphasized his athletic build. His dark hair was neatly combed, and he had shaved so that his jaw was smooth and clean-lined. He looked young and handsome and so genuinely happy to see her that Grace felt her remaining doubts melt away. "Shall we?" He offered his arm and she took it, letting him lead her out into the evening. The social was held in the church hall, already full of people when they arrived. Grace felt every eye turn toward them as they walked through the door, felt the whispers start up like a wave rolling through the crowd. Her step faltered, but Mason's hand came up to cover hers where it rested on his arm, steady and reassuring. "Head high," he murmured. "They can talk all they want, we know the truth." They made their way to the refreshment table, where Mason got them both punch and kept up a running commentary about the various people in attendance that made Grace want to smile despite her nerves. He introduced her to several of his friends from the Double C Ranch, young cowboys who treated her with courtesy and included her in their conversation without a hint of the judgment she had come to expect. When the music started, Mason led her onto the dance floor without hesitation. Grace had always loved dancing, and despite everything, her body remembered the steps. Mason was surprisingly graceful for a cowboy, leading her through the patterns with confidence and keeping up a gentle stream of conversation that distracted her from the stairs. "You dance well," she said as they spun through a turn. "My mother insisted all her sons learn. She said it was the mark of a gentleman, no matter what kind of work a man did." His eyes were warm on her face. "I am grateful for it now, since it gives me an excuse to hold you close." Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks at the intimacy in his voice. This was real, she realized, with a mixture of wonder and terror. Mason Cole was truly courting her, publicly and without shame, despite knowing her story. He was choosing her, and the choice was transforming something fundamental in how she saw herself. The evening was going better than she had dared hope until Mrs. Henderson appeared at the edge of the dance floor, her face pinched with disapproval. She waited until the song ended, then approached Mason with determination. "Mr. Cole, might I have a word?" Mason's jaw tightened, but he nodded politely. "Of course, ma'am. I feel it is my Christian duty to warn you about the company you are keeping. That girl has a reputation, and a smart young man like yourself should not be fooled by a pretty face. She tried to trap one man already with her schemes, and I would hate to see you fall victim to the same." The dancing around them slowed as people turned to watch. Grace wanted to disappear, to run from the hall and never come back, but Mason's hand tightened on hers, holding her in place. "Mrs. Henderson," Mason said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet room, "I appreciate your concern, but it is misplaced. I know Miss Garrett's story, and I find her to be a woman of exceptional character and courage. If others choose to believe gossip over truth, that speaks to their character, not hers. Now, if you will excuse us, I believe the next dance is starting." He swept Grace back onto the floor before Mrs. Henderson could respond, leaving the older woman standing alone with her mouth hanging open. Around them, the crowd erupted in a mixture of scandalized murmurs and a few scattered chuckles. Grace looked up at Mason with tears in her eyes. "You did not have to do that. Now they will talk about you too." "Let them talk," he said firmly. "I meant every word, Grace. You have more courage in your little finger than most people have in their whole bodies, and I am proud to be seen with you." She let him hold her as they danced, let herself believe for the first time that perhaps the frontier truly could offer redemption, that the harsh landscape and rough communities might paradoxically provide more grace than the civilized society that had cast her out. The evening ended with Mason walking her home under a sky full of stars. At the door of the boarding house, he took both her hands and looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Grace, I need you to know something. I am not Jonathan Prescott, and I am not playing games with your heart. My intentions are serious. I am courting you because I believe you could be the woman I build a life with if you are willing. I know it is early to say such things, but I want you to understand where I am heading with this." Grace's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "Mason, I want to believe that, but I am scared. Scared to trust again, scared to hope, scared that this is too good to be true, and something will come along to destroy it." "Then we will face those fears together," he said simply. "One day at a time, Grace, that is all I am asking. Give me today, and tomorrow we will figure out the next day." She nodded, not trusting her voice. Mason leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away, and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. The touch was chaste and reverent, and it made her want to cry at the sheer tenderness of it. "Good night, Grace Garrett," he whispered against her skin. "Thank you for a perfect evening." "Good night, Mason," she managed, and watched him walk away into the darkness before floating inside on a cloud of disbelief and cautious joy. The next weeks fell into a pattern that felt almost too perfect to last. Mason called on Grace whenever his work allowed, taking her on walks and picnics, teaching her to ride horseback, introducing her to the landscape he loved. He never pushed her beyond what she was comfortable with, never made demands or questioned her trust in him. He simply showed up, day after day, consistent and steady, and exactly what he claimed to be. Grace found herself slowly unfurling like a flower that had been closed tight against frost. She laughed more, smiled more, began to believe that perhaps she could have a future that included happiness. The town still talked, but the talk had shifted slightly. Some people still condemned her, but others began to reconsider when they saw how devoted Mason was, how genuinely happy the couple seemed together. Martha watched the courtship with approval and growing affection for the young cowboy who treated her niece like spun glass and her boarding house like a second home. Mason took to helping with repairs around the property, fixing the sagging porch and replacing loose boards on the stairs, refusing payment and saying it was the least he could do for the hospitality. Grace felt herself falling in love, truly in love, for perhaps the first time in her life. What she had felt for Jonathan Prescott had been infatuation and naive trust. What she felt for Mason was deeper and more real. She loved his work-roughened hands and easy laugh, his dreams of the future and respect for her past, his willingness to be seen with her despite the gossip and his absolute certainty that she was worth courting. It was almost enough to make her forget that good things in her life had a tendency to fall apart. The reminder came on a hot afternoon in late July, nearly 2 months after Mason had first asked to walk with her by the creek. Grace was in the kitchen preparing supper when her aunt came in with a troubled expression and a telegram in her hand. "This just arrived for you," Martha said quietly. Grace took the telegram with shaking hands, her stomach dropping when she saw it was from her mother in Denver. She had not heard from her family since arriving in Copper Ridge. The silence had been painful but expected. Why would they be contacting her now? She opened the telegram and read the brief message twice before she could fully process it. "Your father gravely ill. Stop. Doctor says little time remains. Stop. He asks for you. Stop. Come home immediately. Stop. Mother." Grace sank into a chair, the telegram fluttering from her nerveless fingers. Her father was dying. The man who had been so disappointed in her, who had sent her away rather than face the scandal she had brought on the family, was asking for her now at the end. "What is it?" Martha asked, picking up the telegram and reading it quickly. Her face softened with sympathy. "Oh, Grace." "I have to go," Grace heard herself say. "He is my father. Whatever happened between us, I cannot let him die without saying goodbye." "Of course you must go. I will help you pack and get you on the morning stage." Martha hesitated. "Will you tell Mason?" Grace's heart clenched. Mason, the thought of leaving him even temporarily, felt like being torn in half. But more than that, she was afraid. Afraid that going back to Denver would resurrect all the shame she had been slowly healing from, afraid that the distance would make Mason reconsider his feelings, afraid that somehow this would be the thing that finally broke their fragile happiness. "I have to tell him," she said quietly. "He deserves to know." Mason arrived that evening for dinner as usual, but Grace pulled him aside before he could join the others at the table. She led him out to the porch and showed him the telegram, watching his face as he read it. "When do you leave?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Tomorrow morning. I do not know how long I will be gone. It depends on how quickly the end comes." She wrapped her arms around herself against a chill that had nothing to do with the warm evening air. "Mason, I am scared." He pulled her into his arms immediately, holding her close against his chest. "Of course you are scared. Your father is dying. That is terrifying no matter what your history with him." "It is not just that," her voice was muffled against his shirt. "I am scared to go back to Denver to face everyone there again. I am scared that being back in that place will undo all the healing I have done here, and I am scared that when I come back, if I come back, things between us will have changed." Mason pulled back enough to look at her face, his hands framing her cheeks. "Grace, listen to me. Nothing is going to change how I feel about you. Not distance, not time, not anything. Do you understand? You are not getting rid of me that easily." "How can you be sure?" "Because I love you," he said simply, and Grace's breath caught in her throat. "I have loved you since that first dinner when you tried so hard to be invisible, and I could not stop looking at you. I love your strength and your kindness and your courage. I love how you laugh when something catches you by surprise, and I love how you always see the good in people even when they do not deserve it. I love you, Grace Garrett, and no amount of distance is going to change that." Tears streamed down Grace's face as she threw her arms around his neck. "I love you too," she whispered. "I love you so much it scares me. I did not think I could feel this way again, and I am terrified of losing it." "You are not going to lose it. We are not going to lose each other." Mason held her tight, his face buried in her hair. "Go to Denver, say goodbye to your father and make peace with your family if you can, and then come back to me, Grace, because I will be waiting." I will wait as long as it takes." They stood holding each other on the porch as the sun set and the evening stars came out, neither wanting to let go but knowing they had no choice. Finally, Mason pulled back and pressed a kiss to her forehead, her cheeks, and then, with infinite gentleness, to her lips. It was Grace's first real kiss since Jonathan, and it felt nothing like those fumbling, demanding kisses had felt. Mason's kiss was tender and reverent, asking rather than taking, giving rather than demanding. It was a promise and a benediction, and when they finally parted, Grace felt branded by it in the best possible way. "Come back to me," Mason whispered against her lips. "I will," she promised, "I will come back." The stage to Denver left at dawn, and Mason was there to see her off despite having to be at the ranch for work. He held her hand until the last possible moment, then helped her into the coach with a final kiss that had to last them through however many days or weeks they would be apart. Grace watched him through the window as the stage pulled away, her hand pressed to the glass and tears running down her face. Mason stood in the dusty street with his hat in his hands, watching until she was out of sight, and Grace carried that image with her all through the long journey back to the city that had rejected her. Denver looked exactly the same and completely different when she arrived 2 days later. The streets were familiar, the buildings unchanged, but Grace felt like a different person walking through them. She was no longer the naive girl who had trusted too easily or the broken woman who had fled in shame. She was someone new, someone who had been loved by a good man and learned to love herself again. Her mother met her at the door of the family home, older and more worn than Grace remembered. They embraced awkwardly, years of hurt and disappointment sitting heavy between them. "Thank you for coming," her mother said stiffly. "Your father has been asking for you. The doctor says it is only a matter of days now." Grace followed her mother upstairs to the bedroom where her father lay, shocked at how frail he had become. The robust man who had built a successful dry goods business was reduced to a skeletal figure in a too large nightshirt, his breathing labored and his skin gray. "Grace," he whispered when he saw her, and she went to his bedside with tears in her eyes. "I am here, Papa." What followed were the hardest days of Grace's life. She sat by her father's bedside, holding his hand and reading to him, talking about her life in Copper Ridge and carefully avoiding the scandal that had sent her there. Her father drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid and sometimes lost in fever dreams. On the third day, during a moment of clarity, he gripped her hand weakly and looked at her with tears in his faded eyes. "I am sorry, Grace. Sorry for how I handled things with Prescott. Sorry for sending you away instead of standing by you. I was angry and embarrassed, and I let that matter more than my daughter's pain. Can you forgive me?" Grace felt years of hurt crack open in her chest. "I forgive you, Papa, and I am sorry too for disappointing you." "You did not disappoint me, child. I disappointed myself," he coughed weakly. "Tell me about Montana. Tell me you have found some happiness there." So Grace told him about Copper Ridge, about Martha's boarding house and the vast landscape and the kindness she had found in unexpected places. She told him about Mason, about his dreams and his steadiness, and the way he had chosen to see past her reputation to the woman beneath. Her father smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen from him in years. "This cowboy, he treats you well. Better than I ever thought I deserved. Then he is a smart man, and you deserve everything good, Grace. Do not ever let anyone, including yourself, tell you otherwise." He squeezed her hand weakly. "Promise me you will go back to him. Promise me you will let yourself be happy." "I promise, Papa." He died that night peacefully in his sleep, and Grace wept for the complicated man he had been and the relationship they had never quite managed to repair. But beneath the grief was a strange sense of peace, gratitude that they had been able to speak those final words to each other, that she had been able to give and receive forgiveness before the end. The funeral was difficult in ways Grace had not anticipated. The church was full of people who had known about the scandal, who had judged her and found her wanting. She felt their stares and heard the whispers, felt the weight of their speculation about why the fallen daughter had dared to show her face again. But something had changed in Grace. She was not the same woman who had left Denver in shame. She had been loved by Mason Cole, had learned to see herself through his eyes rather than through the condemning gaze of society. So she kept her head high throughout the service and the burial, stood by her mother's side with dignity, and refused to let the gossip see her crumble. Jonathan Prescott appeared at the reception after the funeral, sliding up to her with an oily smile that made her skin crawl. He had put on weight since she had last seen him, his handsome face gone soft and dissolute. "Grace, my condolences on your loss. You look well. Montana must agree with you." Grace looked at him coolly, seeing him clearly for the first time without the blinders of infatuation. He was weak and selfish, a man who took what he wanted and discarded the cost. How had she ever thought herself in love with him? "Thank you, Jonathan, if you will excuse me." She tried to move past him, but he caught her arm. "I heard you are seeing some cowboy now. Really, Grace, do you think that is wise? After everything that happened, you should be more careful about your reputation." Grace felt something hot and fierce rise in her chest. "My reputation is my own concern, Jonathan, as is my choice of companion. Mason Cole is twice the man you will ever be, and I am grateful every day that things ended between us. You did me a favor when you showed your true colors." She pulled her arm free and walked away, leaving him standing with his mouth hanging open. Later, her mother pulled her aside with a strange expression on her face. "I heard what you said to Jonathan. I am proud of you, Grace. I should have said that when everything fell apart, but I was too concerned with what people would think. I am sorry for that. You deserved better from me." Grace embraced her mother, feeling another piece of the past fall into place. "Thank you, Mama. This cowboy you told your father about, is he a good man?" "The best I have ever known." Her mother studied her for a long moment. "Then do not let him go. Real love is rarer than people think, and harder to find than anyone admits. If you have found it, hold on to it with both hands." Grace left Denver 5 days after she had arrived, her father buried and her heart lighter than it had been when she boarded the stage east. She carried letters from her mother and a small inheritance her father had set aside for her, enough to provide a modest security she had never expected to have. But more than that, she carried a sense of closure, of having faced her past and survived it. The journey back to Montana felt endless. Grace counted the miles and the hours, anxious to see Mason again, to tell him everything that had happened, to return to the life they had been building together. When the stage finally rolled into Copper Ridge on a bright August morning, her heart was pounding so hard she could barely breathe. She scanned the street as she stepped down, looking for the tall figure she had been dreaming about for over 2 weeks. For one terrible moment she did not see him, and panic seized her chest. What if he had changed his mind? What if her absence had made him realize she was too much trouble? Then she heard her name, and there he was, running toward her with his hat flying off and the biggest smile she had ever seen on his face. She barely had time to set down her bag before he swept her into his arms, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around. "You came back," he said against her hair. "Grace, you came back." "I promised I would," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "I will always come back to you, Mason." He set her down but did not let her go, his hands framing her face as he looked at her intently. "Are you all right? How was it? Tell me everything." "Later," she said, pulling his face down to hers. "Right now, just kiss me." He did, right there in the middle of the street with half the town watching, and Grace did not care about the scandal or the gossip or anything except the feel of Mason's arms around her and the taste of his kiss. She was home, truly home, for the first time since leaving Denver months ago. The next weeks were a golden haze of happiness. Grace returned to her work at the boarding house, but everything felt different now, lighter and more full of possibility. Mason courted her openly and ardently, making it clear to everyone that he intended to marry Grace Garrett if she would have him. The town gossip slowly had to accept that the scandalous girl and the cowboy were a permanent fixture, and the whispers gradually shifted from condemnation to reluctant acceptance. Grace used part of her inheritance to help her aunt with repairs on the boarding house, and the rest she saved carefully, not sure what the future would hold but wanting to be prepared. Mason continued working at the Double C Ranch, saving every penny he could toward his dream of owning land. It was a good life, better than Grace had ever expected to have, and she was almost afraid to let herself believe it was real. Some part of her still waited for the other shoe to drop, for something to come along and destroy the happiness she had found. The revelation came on a cold evening in late September, nearly 6 months after Mason had first asked to walk with her by the creek. Grace had been feeling unwell for several weeks, tired and queasy in a way that worried Martha even as Grace tried to dismiss it as nothing. Finally, her aunt sat her down one morning and asked the question Grace had been avoiding. "Child, when was your last monthly?" Grace's stomach dropped as she tried to remember, tried to count back the weeks and came up with a number that made her blood run cold. She could not be. They had been so careful, so proper in their courtship. Mason had never pushed for more than kisses, had treated her with nothing but respect and restraint. But there had been that one night, nearly 2 months ago, when he had walked her home after a dance and they had stopped by the creek where they had first talked. The kisses had been deeper than usual, more urgent, and Grace had been the one to pull him closer, to whisper that she trusted him, that she wanted him. They had not gone all the way, not entirely, but they had gone far enough that— "Oh no," Grace whispered, her hand going to her stomach. "Oh no, no, no." Martha's face was sympathetic but troubled. "We should see the doctor to be sure, but Grace, if you are with child, people will talk. They will say this is exactly what they expected from you, that you tried to trap Mason just like they claimed you tried to trap Jonathan Prescott." Grace felt the familiar shame rising up to choke her, the old voice in her head insisting that she was irredeemably stained, that she destroyed everything good she touched. How could she have been so foolish? How could she have made the same mistake twice? Except it was not the same mistake. Jonathan had made promises he never intended to keep and used her trust against her. Mason loved her, had told her so repeatedly, had made his intentions clear to everyone. This was not a trap or a scheme. It was two people who loved each other making a choice in a moment of passion, a choice with consequences they would now have to face together. But what if Mason did not see it that way? What if this was the thing that finally made him realize she was more trouble than she was worth? The doctor confirmed what she already knew. Grace Garrett was pregnant, probably about 8 weeks along. She walked home in a daze, trying to figure out how to tell Mason, what to say to explain this catastrophic development. Martha found her sitting on her bed that evening, staring at nothing. "You have to tell him, Grace. He has a right to know." "I know, I just do not know how. What if this ruins everything? What if he thinks I did this on purpose to trap him?" "Mason Cole is not Jonathan Prescott," Martha said firmly. "That boy has been head over heels for you since the day he met you. Yes, people will talk, and yes, this complicates things, but you need to trust him, Grace. Trust that the love he has shown you is real." Grace nodded, not trusting her voice. She sent word to Mason that she needed to see him urgently, and he showed up at the boarding house within the hour, his face creased with concern. "What is wrong? Are you hurt? Is it your family in Denver?" Grace led him out to the porch where they could have privacy, her hands shaking as she tried to find the words. Finally, she just said it baldly, "Mason, I am pregnant. We are going to have a baby." The silence that followed felt endless. Grace watched the emotions play across Mason's face, shock, confusion, calculation as he counted back the weeks, and then something that looked almost like joy. "A baby," he said slowly. "We are having a baby." "I know what you must be thinking," Grace said quickly, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I know how this looks, that people will say I trapped you, that this is exactly what they expected from someone like me. I do not know how it happened, we were so careful, but I swear to you I did not plan this. I would never do that to you, Mason. I love you too much to trick you or manipulate you. If you want to walk away, I will understand. I will go somewhere else, somewhere people do not know either of us, and I will raise the baby on my own. You do not have to be part of this if you do not want to be." Mason had been staring at her with an unreadable expression, but now he grabbed her shoulders and gave her a gentle shake. "Grace, just stop talking for a minute and let me think." She fell silent, her heart pounding as she waited for him to speak. When he did, his voice was wondering. "You are pregnant. We are going to have a baby. A little person who is part you and part me." He started to smile, a smile that grew until it transformed his whole face. "Grace, this is wonderful." She stared at him in disbelief. "Wonderful." "Mason, people will talk, they will say terrible things about both of us. Your reputation will be ruined because of me. I do not care about my reputation, I care about you and our baby." He pulled her into his arms, his hands settling protectively over her still flat stomach. Grace, I was going to ask you to marry me anyway. I have been carrying my mother's ring in my pocket for 3 weeks waiting for the right moment. This just moves up the timeline a bit. You want to marry me? Grace felt dizzy with relief and disbelief. Even now, even with people saying I trapped you. Especially now, Grace Garrett, I love you. I love everything about you, including this baby we made together. Will you marry me? Will you build a life with me and let me spend every day proving that you are valued and cherished and exactly what I have always wanted? Grace threw her arms around his neck, sobbing with relief and joy and overwhelming gratitude. Yes, yes, I will marry you. I love you so much, Mason. They held each other on the porch as the stars came out, making plans and promises for the future. Mason wanted to marry immediately, before Grace's condition became obvious, to spare her at least some of the gossip. Grace agreed, wanting nothing more than to be his wife and to face whatever came next together. They were married 3 days later in a quiet ceremony at the church, with only Martha and a few of Mason's friends from the ranch in attendance. The preacher was dubious about the rushed timeline but agreed when Mason promised him a generous donation to the church building fund. Grace wore a simple blue dress and carried wildflowers, and when Mason slipped his mother's ring onto her finger and kissed her as his wife, she felt something inside her finally, completely heal. The gossip erupted exactly as expected when word spread about the quick marriage. The town matrons clucked their tongues and did the math on their fingers, predicting scandalously short engagement between wedding and birth. Some people pitied Mason for being trapped, others condemned Grace for her scheming ways, and a few brave souls suggested that maybe two young people in love had simply been human. Mason faced the gossip head-on, making it clear to anyone who would listen that he was thrilled to be married to Grace and looking forward to becoming a father. His quiet certainty and obvious devotion slowly shifted public opinion, or at least muted the worst of the condemnation. It helped that he was well-liked at the ranch, respected for his hard work and honest dealing, and that he never wavered in his support of his wife. Grace moved into Mason's small cabin at the Double C Ranch, a rough structure that was barely big enough for one person, let alone a growing family. Mason apologized for the cramped quarters, promising that someday he would build her a proper house on their own land. Grace just kissed him and told him she would live in a tent if it meant being with him. Life settled into a new rhythm. Grace helped with cooking for the ranch hands and took in mending to earn extra money. Mason worked harder than ever, taking every extra shift and job he could find to save for their future. They were poor and the accommodations were rough, but they were happy in a way that transcended circumstances. The crisis came in late October, when Grace was nearly 4 months along and just beginning to show. Mason had been working with a crew repairing fence line in a remote section of the ranch when one of the posts broke under pressure and sent a tangle of barbed wire whipping toward him. He tried to dodge but was not quite fast enough. The wire caught him across the chest and arms, tearing through his shirt and into his flesh. The other cowboys got him patched up as best they could in the field and brought him back to the ranch unconscious and bleeding. The foreman sent for the doctor and someone to fetch Grace, who came running from the cabin with her heart in her throat. Mason was laid out on a bunk in the ranch house, his chest wrapped in bandages that were already seeping red. The doctor was shaking his head grimly as Grace burst through the door. "The cuts are deep and there is a lot of them," the doctor said bluntly. "I have done what I can to clean and stitch them, but infection is the real danger now. The next few days will tell whether he makes it or not." Grace felt the world tilt around her. Mason could not die, not now, not when they had finally found each other, not when they had a baby coming and a future stretching ahead of them. She went to his side and took his hand, pressing it to her lips as tears streamed down her face. "Do not you dare leave me, Mason Cole," she whispered fiercely. "I did not fight my way back from shame and scandal and heartbreak just to lose you now. We have a life to build together, remember. You promised me forever, and I am holding you to that promise." Mason's eyes fluttered open, hazy with pain and laudanum. "Grace," he mumbled, "baby okay?" "The baby is fine. You just focus on getting better." She smoothed his hair back from his forehead, her voice breaking. "Please, Mason, please do not leave me." "Not going anywhere," he slurred. "Love you too much." Then he slipped back into unconsciousness and Grace settled in by his bedside to keep vigil. The next 3 days were the worst of Grace's life. Mason drifted in and out of fever, sometimes lucid but mostly delirious. The doctor came twice a day to check on him, changing bandages and forcing medicine past his lips, but there was little else to be done except wait and pray. Grace never left his side. She bathed his face with cool water, held his hand through the worst of the fever dreams, and talked to him constantly, telling him about their baby and their future and all the reasons he needed to fight. Martha came out from town to sit with her, and some of the ranch hands stopped by to offer awkward words of encouragement. On the third night, Mason's fever broke. Grace had been dozing in the chair by his bed when she felt his hand squeeze hers. She jerked awake to find him looking at her with clear eyes, weak but aware. "Grace," he said, his voice a rasp, "you look terrible." She burst into tears, half laughing and half sobbing. "You scared me half to death, you foolish man. Do not ever do that to me again." "I will try not to." He attempted a smile that turned into a wince. "How is our baby?" "Fine, the baby is fine. The baby will be even better once the father stops trying to kill himself with fence posts." She leaned forward to kiss his forehead gently. "The doctor says you are going to have scars." "Then I will have scars, small price to pay for staying alive with you." His hand moved weakly to her stomach. "I have too much to live for to give up now." Mason's recovery was slow but steady. Within a week he was sitting up and complaining about being confined to bed. Within 2, he was walking around the cabin and driving Grace crazy with his restlessness. The doctor finally cleared him to return to light work at the end of November, with strict instructions not to overdo it. The accident had one unexpected consequence. It shifted how people in town viewed the young couple. When they heard about Mason's injury and Grace's devoted nursing, when they saw her walking into town with her husband leaning on her arm and her belly beginning to round with their child, something softened in the collective judgment. These were not scheming people playing games. They were a young couple facing life's hardships together and finding strength in each other. The whispers did not stop entirely, but they changed tone. Instead of condemning, they became almost sympathetic, with people noting how devoted the Coles were to each other and speculating that maybe their rushed marriage had been about genuine love after all. Winter set in hard and cold, and Mason chafed at being confined to indoor work while his injuries finished healing. But he used the time to plan their future, sketching out designs for the house he wanted to build on the land he dreamed of owning. He and Grace spent long evenings by the fire, talking about the life they would create together, the family they would raise, the home they would build. "I want our children to grow up knowing they are loved," Mason said one night, his hand on Grace's now prominent belly. "I want them to see their parents as partners, as people who chose each other and keep choosing each other every day. I want them to know that mistakes do not define a person, that fresh starts are always possible, that love is stronger than shame or scandal or anything else the world throws at us." Grace leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the baby flutter inside her. "They will know all of that. We will teach them by how we live, by how we love each other. You made me believe in love, Grace. Before you, I thought the frontier was just about surviving, about working hard and maybe someday getting a little land to call my own. But you taught me that none of that matters if you do not have someone to share it with. You are my home, Grace Cole, no matter where we end up living." She turned her face up to kiss him, gentle because of his still healing injuries, but full of the depth of feeling that grew stronger every day. Mason was right. They had taught each other that love was possible even in the harsh frontier, that two wounded souls could find healing in each other, that shame and scandal were no match for genuine devotion. Christmas came with deep snow and bitter cold. The ranch threw a celebration for all the hands and their families, and Grace was touched by how warmly she was welcomed, how the other women included her in their conversations and asked about her pregnancy with genuine interest. She was becoming part of the community, no longer the scandalous outsider but Mason Cole's wife, expecting their first child and building a life alongside her husband. The winter passed slowly, each day bringing Grace closer to her due time and Mason closer to his goal of saving enough money for a down payment on land. The foreman of the Double C, impressed by Mason's work ethic and character, had quietly spread word that Mason Cole was looking to buy property and would be a good neighbor to anyone willing to sell. By early March, they had a lead on a promising parcel near the mountains, the very land Mason had dreamed about when he first told Grace his plans. Grace was 8 months pregnant and moving carefully when Mason took her to see the property on the first warm day of spring. It was a beautiful piece of land with a creek running through it and a stand of trees that would provide timber for building. Mason walked the property line with Grace leaning on his arm, both of them envisioning the future they would create here. "This is it," Mason said, his voice full of awe. "This is where we build our life, Grace, where we raise our children and grow old together." "Can we afford it?" Grace asked practically, even as her heart soared at the vision he was painting. "With what I have saved and your inheritance, yes. It will be tight and we will have to live simple for a while, but I can build us a cabin before the baby comes. We can do this, Grace. We can make this ours." They bought the land a week later, signing the papers in the land office with hands that shook from excitement and nerves. It was official. Mason and Grace Cole were landowners, with a future stretching ahead of them as solid as the Montana soil beneath their feet. Mason immediately began work on a cabin, enlisting help from his friends at the Double C who came out on their days off to help raise the walls and frame the roof. It was a simple structure, just 2 rooms to start with the promise of more added later, but it was theirs, built on their own land with their own hands and the help of people who had become genuine friends. Grace watched the cabin take shape while dealing with the increasing discomfort of her pregnancy. She could not do much physical work, but she planned the layout of the rooms, sewed curtains from fabric Martha had given her as a wedding gift, and dreamed about the life they would live within those walls. The baby came on a warm afternoon in late April, arriving 3 weeks early and in a hurry. Grace had been hanging laundry outside their new cabin when the first pains hit. Mason had been working on the barn and came running when he heard her cry out, his face going white with panic. "The baby is coming. The baby is coming now," Grace gasped, and Mason practically carried her into the house and sent one of the ranch hands galloping for the doctor and Martha. The birth was hard but mercifully quick. Martha arrived first and helped Grace through the worst of it, while Mason paced outside the bedroom door and prayed harder than he had ever prayed in his life. When the baby's cry finally pierced the air, he burst through the door without waiting for permission. Grace lay exhausted in the bed, her hair damp with sweat and her face pale, but she was smiling as she held a tiny bundle against her chest. Mason approached slowly, almost afraid, and looked down at his child for the first time. "It is a girl," Grace said softly. "We have a daughter, Mason." He reached out with a shaking hand to touch the baby's impossibly small fingers, watching in awe as they curled around his calloused thumb. "She is perfect," he whispered. "Grace, she is absolutely perfect." Martha bustled around cleaning up, giving the new parents space to bond with their baby. The doctor arrived shortly after, checked both mother and baby, and pronounced them healthy despite the early arrival. He left instructions for care and feeding, collected his fee, and departed with a knowing smile at the besotted look on the young father's face. They named her Sarah Martha Cole, after Mason's mother and Grace's aunt, 2 women who had shown them love when they needed it most. Sarah was small but healthy, with dark eyes that seemed to see everything and a surprising amount of dark hair. From the moment she was placed in his arms, Mason was completely in love, spending hours just watching her sleep and marveling that he and Grace had created this perfect little person. The town's last lingering judgment evaporated when people saw the Cole family together. Mason was so obviously devoted to both wife and daughter, so clearly building a solid life on his new property, that even the most cynical gossips had to admit that whatever scandalous beginning the marriage had, it had turned into something real and lasting. Grace had never been happier than she was in those early months of Sarah's life. Yes, they were poor and the work was endless and the cabin was drafty and small. But she had a husband who loved her, a baby who depended on her, and a future that stretched ahead full of possibility rather than shame. She looked back at the broken woman who had stepped off the stage in Copper Ridge a year and a half ago and barely recognized her. Summer passed in a blur of hard work and small joys. Mason and Grace worked their land, with Grace planting a garden and Mason building fences and outbuildings. Sarah grew and thrived, a happy baby who charmed everyone who met her. The ranch hands from the Double C would stop by on their way to town, ostensibly to check on Mason's progress but really to play with the baby and enjoy Grace's cooking. In August, almost exactly a year after Mason had stood up for Grace at the social, they attended the annual community gathering again. This time, Grace walked in with her head high, Mason at her side and baby Sarah in her arms. She was no longer the scandalous outsider but Mason Cole's wife, a mother, a woman building a life in this harsh frontier and earning respect through her strength and character. When Mrs. Henderson approached, Grace braced herself for condemnation. Instead, the older woman surprised her by reaching out to touch Sarah's hand gently. "She is a beautiful baby, Grace. You and Mason must be very proud." "We are, thank you," Grace managed, shocked by the civil tone. Mrs. Henderson met her eyes with something that might have been respect. "I judged you harshly when you first came to town. I believed gossip over truth and condemned you without knowing your story. I am sorry for that. You have proven yourself to be a woman of character, and your husband is blessed to have you." Grace felt tears prick her eyes at the unexpected apology. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. That means a great deal." As the older woman walked away, Mason squeezed Grace's hand and smiled down at her. "See, I told you people would come around. All they needed was time to see who you really are." "Who we really are," Grace corrected. "I could not have done any of this without you, Mason. You gave me back myself when I thought I had lost myself forever." They danced that night with Sarah sleeping peacefully in Martha's arms, and Grace marveled at how much had changed in a year. She was no longer the woman who believed she was irredeemably stained, who thought the frontier was too harsh for love or second chances. Mason had taught her that vulnerability could be strength, that love could heal even the deepest wounds, that the harsh landscape of the West paradoxically offered more grace than the civilized society that had cast her out. The years that followed were not easy, but they were good. Mason and Grace built their ranch slowly, adding cattle and improving the land, expanding the cabin as their family grew. Sarah was joined by a brother and then twin sisters, and the Cole homestead rang with the sounds of children's laughter and the evidence of a life well lived. Grace never forgot where she had come from or the shame she had carried to Montana territory. But she learned to see that pain as part of her story rather than the whole story, a chapter that had led her to Mason and the life they built together. She taught her children about kindness and second chances, about the importance of looking past scandal to see the person beneath, about the strength it took to start over and the grace required to forgive. Mason built the ranch into something solid and lasting, but his proudest accomplishment was the family he and Grace raised together. He never wavered in his devotion to his wife, never let her forget that she was cherished and valued, never allowed the whispers of the past to define their future. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Mason took Grace back to the creek where they had first talked, where he had first told her that he saw past her reputation to the woman beneath. They sat on the same rock, older now and marked by the hard work of frontier life, but still holding hands like newlyweds. "Do you remember what I told you that day?" Mason asked, his thumb stroking across her knuckles. "About how the frontier did not have to be just about surviving, but could be about building something that lasts." "I remember," Grace said softly. "I did not believe it at the time. I thought I was too damaged, too stained by scandal to ever have something real. And now—" She looked at him, at the man who had loved her back to life, who had chosen her every day for 10 years despite easier options, who had built a home and a family with her in this harsh, beautiful land. "Now I know that shame is not permanent, that scandal fades, but love endures. Now I know that the frontier gave me something society never could, the space to become someone new, someone defined by choices rather than mistakes. Now I know that I am exactly where I am supposed to be, with exactly who I am supposed to be with." Mason pulled her close and kissed her, tender and deep, a kiss that still made her heart flutter even after 10 years of marriage and 4 children and countless hardships faced together. When they finally pulled apart, both smiling, Grace pressed her hand to his cheek and spoke the truth that had slowly become the bedrock of her life. "You stole away my shame, Mason Cole. You taught me that I was never damaged goods, just a woman who had been hurt and needed healing. You gave me back myself, and then you gave me a future I never dreamed possible. I love you more than I have words to express. I love you too, Grace, always have, always will." He stood and pulled her to her feet, ready to walk back to the home they had built, the children who waited for them, the life they had created out of scandal and second chances, and the stubborn belief that love could transform even the harshest frontier. "Come on, Mrs. Cole, our family is waiting." Hand in hand, they walked away from the creek and back toward their ranch, 2 people who had found in each other exactly what they needed. Not rescue or redemption, but partnership, understanding, and the kind of love that made the wild frontier feel like home. The whispers that had once defined Grace Garrett had long since faded, replaced by a new story about Grace Cole, the woman who had come to Montana Territory in shame and built a life of dignity, the woman whose courage and strength had earned respect even from those who had once condemned her, the woman who proved that the talk of the town was never as important as the truth of a life well lived. Behind them, the creek continued flowing, constant and unchanged, a witness to the beginning of their story and the countless chapters still to come. Ahead, smoke rose from the chimney of their cabin, where their children played and supper waited, and a future stretched as wide and promising as the Montana sky. Grace had learned that the frontier could be harsh, but it was also honest, stripping away pretense and revealing what truly mattered. And what mattered, what had always mattered, was love. Stubborn, faithful, transformative love that refused to let shame have the final word. The woman who had once believed herself irredeemably stained had learned the most important truth of all. That she was worthy of love, that second chances were real, and that the heart of a good cowboy was more than enough to build a life upon. The scandal that had brought her to Montana Territory had faded into insignificance, remembered only as the unlikely path that had led her home to Mason, to their children, to the ranch they had built with their own hands, and the future they faced together without fear or shame. Grace Garrett Cole had found what she had been seeking all along, though she had not recognized it at first. Not redemption from the judgment of others, but liberation into the truth of who she really was and who she was meant to become. And that truth, lived out day by day in the choices she made and the love she shared, had indeed stolen away her shame and replaced it with something far more valuable. Joy, belonging, and the certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be.